England in the 1160s had a problem that was tearing the kingdom apart. Two court systems, two sets of laws, and nobody could agree on which one had the final say. On one side, you had the king's courts, royal justice backed by the sword and the crown. On the other side, church courts, ecclesiastical justice backed by the pope and the threat of eternal damnation. Here's where it got insane. If you were a member of the clergy, even just a low-level monk or a minor church official, you could commit almost any crime and the king's courts couldn't touch you. Murder, rape, theft, didn't matter. As long as you could prove you were clergy, you got tried in a church court. And church courts didn't execute people. They didn't even imprison them for long. The worst punishment was usually defrocking, losing your clerical status. Then you'd be right back on the streets. Historians call them criminus clerks, clergy who committed crimes, and the numbers were staggering. In a kingdom of maybe 3 million people, there were tens of thousands of clergy, from powerful bishops down to barely literate monks. Any one of them could claim benefit of clergy and escape royal justice. The system wasn't just broken. It was actively protecting criminals as long as they wore the right robes. King Henry II wasn't some tyrant looking to oppress the church. He was trying to run a kingdom where justice actually meant something. When a priest murdered someone's daughter and walked away after a few prayers and penances, people noticed. When monks robbed travelers and got slapped on the wrist by church courts, it undermined everything Henry was trying to build. The king needed revenue, he needed order, and he needed his laws to actually apply to everyone in his kingdom. But the church wasn't about to give up this power. Pope Gregory VII had spent decades establishing that the church answered to God alone, not to kings. This was the Gregorian reform, a wholesale transformation of how religious authority worked. Popes crowned emperors, not the other way around. Bishops owed their loyalty to Rome, not to whatever throne room they happened to live near. For the church, maintaining separate jurisdiction wasn't just about protecting criminal clergy, it was about proving that spiritual authority trumped earthly power. So you had two systems, each claiming ultimate authority, each refusing to bend. And in medieval England, when two powers collided like this, people died. Lots of people. The question wasn't if this would explode into violence. The question was when, and how bloody it would get. Henry II thought he had the perfect solution. A brilliant plan that would solve everything without starting a war with the Pope. He'd put his own man in charge of the church in England. Not just any man, his best friend. Someone who understood royal authority. Someone who'd been at Henry's side for years. Someone the king trusted absolutely. In 1162, Henry II made Thomas Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that's when everything went catastrophically wrong. Thomas Becket was the perfect choice. On paper, anyway. He'd served as Henry's chancellor since 1155, the king's right-hand man for 7 years. They hunted together, fought together, drank together. Becket had proven himself ruthlessly effective at executing royal policy. When Henry needed someone to collect taxes, Becket squeezed every penny. When Henry needed diplomatic missions, Becket charmed foreign courts. When Henry went to war, Becket led troops and paid for military campaigns out of his own pocket. The two men were so close that contemporaries gossiped about their friendship. They were roughly the same age, both brilliant, both ambitious. Becket, dressed in furs and silk, lived in luxury that rivaled the king's own court, and threw elaborate feasts that became legendary. He understood power, how to get it, and how to use it. He was a secular administrator who happened to be technically clergy, low-level clergy, the kind that let him benefit from church courts if necessary, but he'd never even been fully ordained as a priest. Henry's logic was beautiful in its simplicity. Make Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious authority in England. Becket would remain loyal to his friend and king. With Becket controlling the church, Henry could finally reform those ecclesiastical courts, bring clergy under royal jurisdiction, and solve the criminus clerks problem once and for all. The church would cooperate because one of their own was in charge. Perfect. On June 3, 1162, Thomas Becket was consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury, and something inside him changed. Not gradually, not subtly, immediately and completely. The man who'd lived in luxury started wearing a hair shirt, a scratchy garment made of animal hair worn directly against the skin, as constant penance. The administrator who'd squeezed taxes for the crown started defending church property against royal taxation. The friend who'd executed royal policy began citing canon law against his former partner. Within months, Becket had transformed from Henry's creature into the church's champion. Historians debate whether Becket's conversion was genuine spiritual awakening or calculated political theater. But here's what we know for certain. His actions changed completely. He resigned as chancellor immediately. He began living an ascetic lifestyle that shocked his former friends. And when Henry pushed for reforms to church courts, Becket didn't just resist. He fought back with everything the church had. October 1163, Council of Westminster. Henry proposed what seemed like a reasonable compromise. Criminus clerks would first be tried in church courts, but if found guilty, they'd be handed over to royal courts for punishment. The church could maintain its jurisdiction. The crown would ensure actual justice. Everyone wins. Becket said, no, absolutely not. That would be double jeopardy. punishing someone twice for the same crime. The church's verdict was final. Henry was furious, but still trying to manage this through negotiation. He called a larger council. January 1164, Clarendon Palace. Henry had prepared a document, the Constitutions of Clarendon. 16 clauses designed to clarify the relationship between church and state. Some were reasonable administrative updates, others cut straight to the heart of ecclesiastical independence. Clause 3 stated it explicitly. Clergy found guilty in church courts would be stripped of clerical protection and handed to royal justice. Henry forced a document on the assembled bishops. Most of them signed, were terrified of opposing the king and smart enough to read the political winds. But Becket resisted. He argued, he delayed, he tried every legal maneuver he could find. Finally he submitted, signing the document. Then immediately after leaving Clarendon, he recanted. He wrote to the Pope saying he'd been forced to sign under duress and asking for absolution. The friendship was over. The political calculation had exploded in Henry's face. Instead of gaining control over the church, he'd created an enemy who knew all his secrets, understood all his strategies, and now had the moral authority of the Archbishop's office behind him. What happened next wasn't just a political dispute, it became a personal vendetta between two men who'd once been inseparable. Henry summoned Becket to trial on charges of financial misconduct from his time as Chancellor. Becket showed up but refused to recognize the court's authority over an archbishop. The confrontation was volcanic. Henry wanted Becket destroyed. Becket defied him to his face. On November 2, 1164, Thomas Becket fled England. He disguised himself, snuck through royal checkpoints, and made it across the Channel to France. He'd spend the next 6 years in exile, living in Cistercian monasteries while conducting a propaganda war against the King of England. The man Henry thought would solve all his problems had become the single biggest threat to royal authority. And the truly terrifying part, neither man was going to back down. Henry had his pride, his authority, and his vision of royal supremacy on the line. Becket had his principles, his interpretation of church independence, and now, increasingly, his identity as a religious martyr in the making. Between 1164 and 1170, these two former friends would escalate a political dispute into something far more dangerous, because in December 1170, Thomas Becket would do something so provocative that it would finally push Henry II past the breaking point, and for knights would decide to solve the king's problem permanently. 6 years. Thomas Becket spent 6 years in exile, living in French monasteries while Europe watched two of the most powerful men of the age tear each other apart. This wasn't a clean political dispute. This was personal, vindictive, and it was destroying lives on both sides. Becket based himself at Pontigny Abbey in France, a Cistercian monastery that gave him sanctuary. From there, he conducted what amounted to medieval propaganda warfare. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, to bishops across Europe, to the Pope, to anyone who would listen. He portrayed himself as a defender of church liberty against a tyrannical king. He excommunicated Henry's supporters, threatened to place all of England under interdict, which would shut down religious services across the entire kingdom, and he made himself into a symbol of resistance against royal overreach. Henry fought back with everything he had. He confiscated church property in England. He expelled Becket's supporters and relatives from the kingdom, forcing them into poverty and exile. He pressured the Cistercian orders so effectively that they eventually asked Becket to leave Pontigny because his presence was causing them too many problems with the English crown. He sent threatening messages through diplomatic channels. At one point, Henry allegedly explored having Becket assassinated in exile, though the evidence for this is debated among historians. But here's where it got complicated. Pope Alexander III was caught in the middle of an impossible situation. He needed Henry II's support because there was an anti-pope, Victor IV, and later Paschal III, backed by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Alexander couldn't afford to alienate one of the most powerful kings in Christendom, but he also couldn't abandon Becket without looking weak on church independence, the core principle of the Gregorian reform. So Alexander played both sides. He supported Becket verbally but restrained him from his most extreme measures. He refused to grant Becket permission to place England under interdict, even though Becket begged for it repeatedly. He encouraged negotiations, pushed for compromise, and basically tried to manage two proud, stubborn men who would rather destroy each other than admit defeat. The negotiations went nowhere. Multiple times over 6 years, Henry and Becket met for talks. Multiple times they seemed close to agreement, and multiple times, one or both of them would sabotage the process. Henry would demand Becket submit completely to royal authority. Becket would demand Henry acknowledge full church independence. Neither would bend. Meanwhile, Henry had a succession problem. His eldest son, also named Henry, called the young king, needed to be crowned to secure the succession. But by tradition, the Archbishop of Canterbury crowned English kings. Becket was in exile. Henry couldn't wait indefinitely. So in June 1170, Henry had his son crowned by the Archbishop of York, Roger de Pontlevac, who was one of Becket's rivals and enemies within the church. This was a deliberate insult to Becket's authority. The Archbishop of Canterbury had exclusive right to crown English monarchs. By having York perform the ceremony, Henry was essentially saying Becket didn't matter anymore. He'd bypassed him completely. Other bishops participated in the coronation: Gilbert Folliot, Bishop of London, and Jocelyn de Beauharnais, Bishop of Salisbury. All of them were firmly in Henry's camp, but the pressure for reconciliation was mounting. The Pope was pushing Henry. French King Louis VII, who was sheltering Becket, wanted the embarrassment of this dispute resolved. Henry's own advisors were warning him that this conflict was damaging his reputation across Europe. After 6 years, something had to give. July 22, 1170, Friedeville in France. Henry II and Thomas Becket met face-to-face for the first time in years. They talked, they negotiated, they reached an apparent agreement. Becket would return to England, Henry would restore church properties. They'd put the past behind them. Witnesses described an emotional reconciliation, even talk of renewed friendship. But here's what the agreement didn't include. Henry never explicitly promised to enforce the constitutions of Clarendon, and Becket never explicitly renounced his opposition to them. Both men thought they'd won. Both men were setting up for another collision. December 1, 1170. Thomas Becket returned to England after 6 years of exile. He landed at Sandwich and made his way to Canterbury. Crowds came out to see him. People treated him like a returning hero, a defender of the faith who'd stood up to royal tyranny. The reception must have been intoxicating after years of exile and uncertainty. Becket wasted no time. He had unfinished business with those bishops who'd participated in the young king's coronation. On Christmas Day 1170, during his sermon at Canterbury Cathedral, Thomas Becket publicly excommunicated the Archbishop of York, the Bishop of London, and the Bishop of Salisbury. He declared that their participation in crowning the young king had been illegal, a violation of Canterbury's ancient rights, and a betrayal of church authority. This wasn't reconciliation. This was a declaration of war. Becket had returned to England and immediately attacked the king's most loyal bishops. The excommunicated bishops fled to Normandy, where Henry was spending Christmas. They arrived at the royal court, furious, humiliated, and demanding justice. Henry II was at Bears Castle in Normandy, celebrating Christmas with his court, when he received the news. The man he'd reconciled with just 5 months earlier had stabbed him in the back. Becket had made Henry look like a fool in front of all of Europe. The king's carefully constructed compromise was in ruins. His bishops were disgraced, and Becket was in Canterbury, triumphant and defiant. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. The exact words Henry spoke are uncertain. Different chroniclers record different versions, but the meaning was clear. Some sources say, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Others record, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nurtured in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" Another version, "Have I no one who will deliver me from this turbulent priest?" The exact words don't matter. What matters is that 4 knights heard them. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton. They were nobles, warriors, men who'd built their careers on serving the king. They understood what Henry wanted, even if he never explicitly ordered it. They left the Christmas court separately, trying not to draw attention. They made arrangements to meet on the road, and they headed for Canterbury. The date was December 27, 1170. They had 2 days to reach England and solve the king's problem, permanently. The 4 knights crossed from Normandy to England on December 28. They didn't travel together. That would have been too obvious. They rendezvoused in Kent and made their way toward Canterbury, picking up additional soldiers along the way. By the afternoon of December 29, they had about 12 armed men total. Enough to intimidate, enough to overwhelm resistance, but not so many that they'd attract attention before they were ready. December 29, 1170, approximately 3 p.m. The 4 knights arrived at the Archbishop's palace in Canterbury. Thomas Becket was finishing dinner with several monks and advisors, including John of Salisbury, one of the most prominent intellectuals of the age. The knights entered the hall, still wearing their travel clothes, not their armor. This was initially a negotiation, not an execution. What happened next is documented by multiple eyewitnesses. Edward Grimm, a monk visiting from Cambridge, was present. William Fitzstephen, one of Becket's clerks, witnessed the events. Their accounts vary in some details, but the core narrative is consistent across sources. Reginald Fitzurse did most of the talking initially. The knights demanded that Becket go to the young King Henry and apologize. They demanded he lift the excommunications of the bishops. They insisted he acknowledge his crimes against the crown. Becket refused everything. He stated that the bishops had violated church law by participating in an illegal coronation. He said he would not submit to royal authority in matters of church governance. He basically told the knights to go to hell. The confrontation escalated quickly. Voices rose. Threats were made. At one point, Fitzurse reportedly grabbed Becket and tried to physically drag him outside. The plan, historians believe, was to arrest Becket and take him by force to the young king. But Becket fought back. For a man who'd transformed into an ascetic archbishop, he still had the physical strength of someone who'd once led military campaigns. He pushed Fitzurse away. Becket's supporters moved to defend him. The knights realized this wasn't going to be a simple arrest. The knights left the hall, but they didn't leave the palace grounds. They went outside and put on their armor, chainmail, helmets, swords. They were done negotiating. One of them allegedly shouted, King's men, to rally their soldiers and intimidate any resistance. Inside the palace, Becket's advisors were panicking. It was almost 5 p.m., time for Vespers, the evening prayer service. The monks begged Becket to hide, to lock himself in the palace, to escape through side doors into the surrounding town. Canterbury had plenty of people who would shelter the archbishop. Becket refused. He insisted on attending Vespers in the cathedral. The church was his domain, his refuge. He would not hide like a criminal. Becket walked from the palace to Canterbury Cathedral. It was only a short distance, connected by a cloister. His monks and advisors followed, still begging him to reconsider. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of armed men returning, armored footsteps on stone, the ring of metal on metal. The monks tried to shut and bar the cathedral doors. Becket ordered them opened. A church, he said, should not be turned into a fortress. The doors to the house of God must remain accessible to all. The cathedral was dimly lit by candles. Vespers had begun, monks chanting evening prayers. Becket moved through the church toward the choir, the area near the altar reserved for clergy. He was still trying to participate in the service, to maintain the routine of religious life, even as armed knights burst through the cathedral doors behind him. The 4 knights entered the cathedral: Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton. They were fully armored, swords drawn, in a sacred space during religious services. Some of their soldiers stayed at the doors, blocking exits and keeping the monks from interfering. The knights moved through the church, looking for Becket in the dim candlelight. They found him near the altar of St. Benedict, in the north transept of the cathedral. Edward Grimm, the visiting monk, was with him. Other clergy were nearby, but most were frozen in shock. Armed men with drawn swords in the cathedral during prayers. This was sacrilege beyond anything they'd witnessed. "Where is the traitor?" Fitzurse shouted. Becket didn't answer. "Where is the archbishop?" Becket responded. "Here I am. No traitor, but archbishop and priest of God." What happened next lasted maybe 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes would echo through history for centuries. The knights tried one more time to get Becket to come with them peacefully. He refused. William de Tracy grabbed Becket, trying to drag him toward the door. Edward Grimm and other clergy tried to defend the archbishop. The situation dissolved into chaos. Fitzurse swung first. His sword came down on Becket's head, but the archbishop was still struggling, and the blow wasn't clean. It struck his shoulder and scalp. Edward Grimm threw his arm up to protect Becket, and the sword nearly severed Grimm's arm, cutting down to the bone. Grimm would survive but carry the wound for the rest of his life. The second blow came from William de Tracy. This one caught Becket full on the head, a massive strike that brought him to his knees. Blood poured from the wound. Becket was still conscious, still trying to maintain his composure. According to Edward Grimm's account, Becket's last words were, "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church, I am ready to embrace death." The third blow, from Richard le Breton, split Becket's skull open. The Archbishop of Canterbury collapsed on the cathedral floor, his blood spreading across the stone. But the knights weren't finished. A man named Hugh of Horsham, called MacClurk, or evil cleric, who was apparently some kind of subdeacon or lower clergy who'd joined the knights, stepped forward with his sword. He placed the tip in the gaping wound in Becket's skull and scattered the archbishop's brains across the cathedral floor. "Let us go," he reportedly said. "This fellow will not get up again." The knights left. They ransacked Becket's palace, looking for documents, evidence of treason or correspondence with the king's enemies. They found nothing useful. They rode away from Canterbury as quickly as they could. Behind them, in the cathedral, Thomas Becket's body lay in a spreading pool of blood on the stone floor. His skull split open, surrounded by horrified monks who couldn't quite process what they'd just witnessed. The murder of an archbishop, in his own cathedral, during prayers, by knights who'd come from the king's court. This wasn't just a killing. This was sacrilege. This was the kind of act that ended kingdoms and started wars. And when word spread across England and then across Europe, the reaction would be immediate and catastrophic. But first, there was the blood. So much blood, spreading across the cathedral floor. And people were already moving toward it, not away from it. Because medieval people recognized something the knights had completely missed. Thomas Becket hadn't just been murdered, he'd been martyred. And that blood on the cathedral floor was about to become the most valuable substance in England. The monks of Canterbury Cathedral stood frozen for several minutes after the knights left. Thomas Becket's body lay on the stone floor, blood and brain matter spreading in the candlelight. Finally, someone moved, then another, and then something happened that the 4 knights, riding away from Canterbury as fast as their horses could carry them, never anticipated. People started collecting the blood, not to clean it up, to preserve it. Monks dipped cloths in the archbishop's blood. Local people who'd rushed to the cathedral after hearing about the attack pushed forward with whatever containers they had. Within hours, vials of Becket's blood were being distributed across Canterbury. Within days, they'd spread across England. The blood of a martyr, killed for defending the church against royal tyranny. But the real transformation happened when they prepared Becket's body for burial. The monks removed his outer garments, the rich vestments of an archbishop. Underneath, they found something that shocked everyone present. Thomas Becket was wearing a hair shirt, a coarse garment made of animal hair worn directly against the skin as constant penance. He'd worn it secretly, hidden under his archbishop's robes, and he was covered in lice and vermin from the filthy garment. They found more. Becket had been using disciplines, instruments of self-flagellation, beating himself regularly as penance. The man who'd lived in luxury as chancellor, who'd once competed with the king in displays of wealth and power, had spent his years as archbishop living in deliberate physical suffering. The transformation hadn't been theater, it had been genuine mortification of the flesh, hidden from public view. This discovery was explosive. It proved that Becket's conversion had been real. The ascetic lifestyle, the defiance of the king, the willingness to die rather than submit, all of it was backed by secret suffering that only God and Becket knew about. In medieval religious terms, this was the mark of authentic sanctity. The people who'd criticized Becket as prideful or political now had to confront evidence of genuine religious devotion. The miracles started immediately. Not years later, not after careful investigation. Immediately, a blind woman claimed her sight returned after touching a cloth soaked in Becket's blood. A paralyzed man said he could walk after praying at the site of the murder. A boy who'd been sick for years recovered after his parents gave him water mixed with a drop of the archbishop's blood. Were these genuine miracles? Mass hysteria. Desperate people finding hope in tragedy. Medieval sources report them as facts. Modern historians debate their nature. But what's undeniable is that people believed, and their belief had enormous consequences. Canterbury Cathedral became a pilgrimage site overnight, not gradually over years. Overnight, people flooded to Canterbury from across England, then from across Europe. They wanted to pray at the site where Becket died. They wanted to touch the stones where his blood had spilled. They wanted vials of water that had been mixed with scrapings of his dried blood, creating what became known as Canterbury water. The cathedral monks couldn't keep up with demand. Meanwhile, in Normandy, King Henry II was having the worst realization of his life. He'd wanted Becket silenced, removed, defeated. He'd gotten a martyr. The four knights had thought they were solving the king's problem. Instead, they'd created a saint, and that saint was infinitely more dangerous to royal authority than Thomas Becket, the troublesome archbishop, had ever been. When news of the murder reached Henry, his reaction was documented by multiple sources. He locked himself in his chamber for 3 days. He refused food. He wept. He raged. Whether this was genuine horror at what had happened or political calculation about the disaster he was facing, we can't know for certain. But Henry understood immediately that this was catastrophic for his reputation and his authority. The Pope acted with stunning speed. Pope Alexander III, who'd spent 6 years trying to mediate between Henry and Becket, now had an actual martyr on his hands. The political calculation shifted completely. On February 21, 1173, less than 3 years after Becket's death, Pope Alexander canonized Thomas Becket as a saint. 3 years. For context, most canonizations in this period took decades. Some took centuries. The speed was unprecedented. The canonization wasn't just religious recognition, it was a political weapon. By making Becket a saint, the Pope was declaring that the archbishop had been right. The Church's position on ecclesiastical independence was vindicated. Henry II's attempt to control church courts was condemned, and every Christian in Europe was now obligated to view Thomas Becket as a holy martyr killed by agents of a tyrannical king. Henry couldn't fight this. He couldn't execute a saint. He couldn't suppress the cult that was growing around Becket's tomb. He couldn't even criticize Becket without appearing to attack a martyred servant of God, the man who'd been his friend. Then his enemy had become something far more powerful in death than he'd ever been in life, a symbol of resistance that would outlast Henry's reign and every reign that followed. The cult of St. Thomas Becket spread like wildfire. Churches across Europe began displaying relics, usually vials of Canterbury water or fragments of cloth stained with his blood. Pilgrims traveled from France, Germany, Spain, Italy. Canterbury became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Christendom, rivaling even Rome and Santiago de Compostela. The economic impact on Canterbury was enormous. An entire industry sprang up around serving pilgrims: inns, food vendors, sellers of pilgrim badges and souvenirs. The monks of Canterbury Cathedral became curators of a saint's cult. They recorded miracles, hundreds of them, in official miracle collections. They created elaborate shrines around Becket's tomb, decorating them with gold, jewels, and offerings from grateful pilgrims. They sold ampulla, small metal containers of Canterbury water, stamped with images of the martyrdom. They essentially invented medieval religious tourism, but the political implications were even more significant. Every time someone prayed to St. Thomas Becket, they were implicitly endorsing the idea that church authority superseded royal authority. Every miracle attributed to Becket reinforced the narrative that he'd been right to resist the king. Every pilgrim who traveled to Canterbury was participating in a centuries-long referendum on the limits of royal power. Henry II had wanted to control the church. Instead, he'd created a permanent monument to the idea that some things were beyond royal control. The blood on the cathedral floor hadn't been cleaned away. It had been preserved, multiplied, distributed, and turned into one of the most powerful political and religious symbols in medieval Europe. And Henry was going to have to do something about it, something that would humiliate him in front of the entire Christian world. July 12, 1174, 4 years after the murder, King Henry II of England, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, ruler of an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury. He was dressed in a simple pilgrim's robe, without any of the symbols of kingship. He'd left his royal entourage outside the city. This wasn't a state visit, this was penance. Henry entered Canterbury Cathedral and walked to Thomas Becket's tomb. There, in front of approximately 80 monks, the King of England submitted to public flogging. Each monk struck Henry 5 times with a rod. Some accounts say they used branches, others say leather straps. The exact instrument doesn't matter. What matters is that the king who'd wanted to dominate the church was being physically beaten by church representatives, at the tomb of the man his words had killed, in front of witnesses who would tell this story across Europe. Henry spent the entire night in vigil at Becket's tomb. No bed, no comfort, praying on the cold stone floor of the cathedral. When he finally left Canterbury the next morning, he'd completed one of the most dramatic public penances in medieval history. The king had submitted to the saint. Royal authority had bowed to religious martyrdom. Why did Henry do this? The political situation had become impossible. Henry was facing rebellion from his own sons. The King of France was supporting the rebels. Scottish forces were invading northern England. Everything was falling apart simultaneously, and there was a growing narrative that these disasters were divine punishment for Becket's murder. Henry needed to break that narrative, needed to show that he'd made peace with the martyred archbishop, needed to prove that God's wrath wasn't following him. Did it work? Historians note that within days of Henry's penance, his military situation improved dramatically. The King of Scotland was captured. The rebellions began to collapse. Whether this was divine intervention, political theater having its intended effect, or just coincidence, medieval people saw it as proof that St. Thomas had accepted Henry's repentance. The king had humbled himself, and the saint had shown mercy. But the deeper irony was just beginning. For the next 350 years, Canterbury Cathedral and the cult of St. Thomas Becket would be central to English religious and political life. Millions of pilgrims would make the journey. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 1390s, features pilgrims traveling to Becket's shrine and telling stories along the way. The shrine became one of the wealthiest religious sites in England, decorated with gold and jewels worth more than most cathedrals' entire treasuries. Every king who wanted to demonstrate piety visited Becket's shrine. Every political crisis involving church-state relations invoked Becket's martyrdom. The 4 knights who'd killed Becket became symbols of royal overreach. Their names were cursed. Their families carried the stigma for generations. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville and William D. Tracy all died within a few years of the murder. Some sources say they went on crusade as penance and died in the Holy Land, though the evidence is disputed. Richard Le Breton's fate is less clear, but his family's coat of arms was later said to bear for birds called Becket's martlets, as perpetual reminder of their ancestors' crime. The system Henry had tried to reform remained essentially unchanged. The benefit of clergy continued to protect clerics from royal justice for centuries after Becket's death. The murder had made church independence untouchable. No English king would dare challenge ecclesiastical jurisdiction with the force Henry had tried to use. The blood on the cathedral floor had achieved what Becket's arguments never could. It had made resistance to royal authority sacred. But here's where the story takes its final ironic turn. In 1538, nearly 370 years after Becket's murder, another King Henry came to Canterbury. Henry VIII, in the middle of his break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, ordered the destruction of Thomas Becket's shrine. The gold and jewels were seized for the crown. Becket's bones were removed and possibly burned, though sources disagree on their exact fate. Henry VIII declared that Thomas Becket hadn't been a saint at all, but a traitor to the crown. His feast day was removed from the calendar. His images were ordered destroyed throughout England. Think about that symmetry. Henry II had accidentally created England's most powerful saint by having him killed. Henry VIII's trying to assert royal supremacy over the church just as Henry II had attempted, ended up destroying the cult that the earlier Henry's actions had created. The monarchy that Becket had resisted eventually won, but it took over 3 centuries and required breaking with the entire Catholic Church to do it. The ultimate legacy of Thomas Becket's murder is this. Sometimes attempting to consolidate power through violence creates exactly the kind of resistance that makes that power impossible to maintain. Henry II wanted an obedient archbishop. He got a martyr whose cult would challenge royal authority for centuries. He wanted to bring the church under control. He created a symbol of church independence that would outlast his entire dynasty. The 4 knights thought they were solving a problem when they rode to Canterbury on December 29, 1170. They were following what they believed were their king's wishes, eliminating a troublesome priest who'd defied royal authority once too often. Instead, they turned a political dispute into a sacred cause. They transformed a difficult archbishop into an eternal symbol. They took a man who was losing his struggle against the king and gave him a victory that would echo through centuries. Thomas Becket's blood on the cathedral floor was never really cleaned away. It was multiplied, distributed, preserved, and turned into one of medieval England's most powerful religious and political forces. The horrific final days of Thomas Becket, from his return to England on December 1st through his brutal murder on December 29th, lasted less than a month. But those days created a legacy that would shape English history for centuries. The man who wouldn't bend to a king became the saint who kings had to bend to, and the knights who thought they were serving royal authority ended up creating the most powerful argument against unlimited royal power that medieval England would ever know. Sometimes the bloodiest mistakes in history are the ones that seem like solutions at the time.